Very good morning, dear colleagues, dear friends, everyone following this broadcast organized by the New Europe Center. I'm Serhiy Solodky. I'm Deputy Director of the Analytical Center, New Europe Center. This is an online event. Our public discussion is dedicated to the most relevant, to the most topical issue to do with the support of Ukraine from the European societies and European states. To discuss this question, we have drafted two analytical papers. One paper was drafted by myself and my colleague, Mariana Fakhurdinova, who will briefly outline the recommendations formulated in the analytical note. Also within this initiative, we prepared an expert survey where the representatives of the European countries suggested their recommendations on the way to uphold or even strengthen the European support for Ukraine. All the references are available at the New Europe Center website, and we'd be very happy for you to have a look at them. I urge all the viewers of our stream to pose their question, to formulate their comments. We will be giving a Facebook transmission for the Ukrainian-speaking audience. The English-speaking audience can pose their questions on the YouTube. I will voice them as we go along with the event so that the speakers could respond, provide their feedback and comments. I would like to give my special thanks to the International Renaissance Foundation, the Sweden Embassy, for the support they have given us within the initiative of supporting the think tanks in Ukraine, drafting these analytical findings, and this discussion was enabled with their support through this initiative. I would like to give the floor now to my colleague, Mariana Fakhurdinova, the research fellow at the New Europe Center, for her to introduce the recommendations. They are the findings of the analytical center, but also it is an effort of our colleagues across Europe that we have interviewed, that we have kindly asked for their feedback, and we drew on their comments to formulate the recommendations to the Ukrainian government on what action to take to maintain the support of the European society. We had Roland Frondestein and Miriam Kosmer that both helped make the findings. And now Mariana will give us the key takeaways for Ukraine. Over to you, Mariana. Thank you, Serhiy. Thank you, colleagues, for joining this event. Today, I would like to represent the study which called Winter is Coming, How to Maintain the Support of European Societies for Ukraine. The winter indeed is coming, posing challenges for the Europeans who are seeing the energy bills on the rise, seeing an economic downturn. The coming of the winter is posing massive challenges for the Ukrainians. How do we make through the winter without water, electricity, heating for hours? How do we continue liberating Ukrainian territories under the winter conditions? So in this context, the support of our partners is becoming of even more importance. Humanitarian, military, financial assistance is very important, but political support is of paramount importance, and people have had a large sway on the political importance. The European society have demonstrated incredible solidarity with Ukraine when they have taken to the street urging their governments to stand with Ukraine. So our center decided to research the questions, the issues that worry Europeans and European societies and governments, and how we can maintain the support of Europe. Let me say a couple of words about the methodology of the study. So he had mentioned that we had drawn a number of sources of information. We reviewed the social surveys conducted in the EU member states. we did media monitoring, looking at the topics most popular in the European mass media covering the war in Ukraine. And we also had an expert survey of the interest shown in Europe, where we analyzed how the EU experts perceive the problems, threats, concerns amongst the European societies. So we have seen that the issues of greatest importance to the Europeans include the price hikes on energy, and the greater threat is the weakening attention to the war, the sense of the culminating threat amongst the Europeans, and often failure to see how important their help is, a low level of expertise on Ukraine in a number of countries. So based on these findings, based on these outcomes, we have formulated a set of recommendations which you can read in greater detail in our study, and I have grouped them into three key blocks that I would like to draw your attention to. And surely you can read the text of this study for more detail. So the first block of recommendation had to do with the messengers that we need to broadcast to foreign audiences, to the audiences in Europe. We need to keep emphasizing about the true goals of the Russian Federation in this war, keep saying that the economic hardship is a direct consequence of the Russian aggression and not of the war as such, and that winning the dependence of the on the Russian Federation is fully within the European interest, and that the Ukrainian party needs to remember that these are the messages for the foreign audiences, have to be about Russia, about the war, but much more so about Ukraine. For that, we recommend using the European media, a number of expert forums to bring more first-hand accounts from Ukraine, the stories of real people who have survived Russian captivity, who have survived Russian horrors of occupation, who have their first-hand experiences to share how the war had torn the lives of the Ukrainian people. And this will have a greater resonance with the Europeans, and we need to show positive messages about Ukraine, demonstrating that in this war with the Russian Federation, Ukraine is fighting to reaffirm the rule of law, to combat corruption, and reaffirm its values. The second block of recommendations that we have identified have to do with the fact that we need to target our communications closely. That is relevant for the global level, where Ukraine needs to do more with some countries to emphasize the arms delivery, whilst with others we need to talk about the post-war reconstruction and humanitarian support. We need to remember to give our sincerest thanks and use creative messages of gratitude. This wasn't our idea, but one of the experts came out with a suggestion that Ukraine could launch a public campaign to place the words of gratitude on the billboards in the EU member states. So we need to think out of the box to find ways to demonstrate our gratitude in Europe and beyond. We also need to go at the local level, and the Ukrainian party needs to consider communication formats with the trade unions in the EU to talk to people who've been worst hit by the price hikes, that this is not happening through the fault of Ukraine. And the third group of recommendation had to do with who do we communicate with, who are our target audiences. So our ambitious answer that we need to communicate to all the stakeholders that can advocate Ukraine abroad, the governments, of course, the parliaments, the expert communities, but a much broader range of civil society organizations, public ambassadors, so the Ukrainians who've been evacuated, who are now living abroad temporarily, who can help promote Ukraine in their host countries. And we can talk about how we can best address European politicians, intellectual experts, journalists, who have their voice in their countries, the EU member states, that other people will look up to. So they need to be encouraged to help promote Ukraine in their countries. This is a very short excerpt of the analytical findings made by the New Europe Center. I know my colleagues will also contribute their insights, and hopefully we can come up with a nice set of recommendations for the Ukrainian government. Thank you, Mariana. I would like to emphasize that it is indeed a short excerpt, as we had formulated over 20 highly nuanced recommendations, but we had to select the key. So we encourage all the stakeholders to have a look at the documents, as there's a wealth of information contained there. Now, I'd like to give the floor to Nadia Koval, who is the head of Information and Analytics Department of the Ukrainian Institute. But I am asking Nadia to contribute to the discussion as a representative of the Institute, but so much more as a person who's been analyzing the treatment of Ukraine by the Europeans, the way Ukraine is treated in the analytical publications by the European think tanks, the way Ukraine is perceived by the common European citizen. Nadia has a most extensive analytical background and the sense of what's moving the European society, what's important to them, what's less important, and how do we reach out to the hearts and minds of the people who may still be hesitating or not really knowing the situation, although they might be few. So, Nadia, what's your vision? What does Ukraine need to do now to maintain the support of the European society, but also to ramp it up? Thank you, Serhii. Thank you for this invitation to your event. I've been following your research with great interest. But let me start with the end of my statement, and this won't be a reflection or recommendation, but rather an idea. When we discuss the war waged by the Russian Federation against Ukraine, in the expert circles in Ukraine and abroad, there's an understanding that law is here to stay, and we need to maintain support, and we have short-term challenges of getting through the winter, getting through the energy crisis, getting through some fatigue of some people from Europe or certain strata of society with the European issue. But there are also the longer term challenges of the support. And in my opinion, they are about the numerous problems with the perception of Ukraine in a number of countries, with the understanding of what is going on in Ukraine, with the way the expert knowledge is drawn. Mariana, in her presentation, mentioned that there are a few gaps with the expert understanding of Ukraine in a number of European countries. These are the problems that exacerbate each other, because to maintain the long-lasting support, the European societies need to see us as one of them, as people they can relate to, as people they can understand, as people we share a future together and we share security interests together, like the defense from Russia, a common future for European integration. And lately, we've been studying at the Ukrainian Institute and through other research platforms with our colleagues from New Europe Center as well, we had a number of studies about the perception of Ukraine and Ukrainian culture abroad, showing that the perception is positive overall, but the level of knowledge is very low. People have very little knowledge about Ukraine. Ukraine hasn't hit the headlines apart from some top news cycle. We are also doing a study of the way the Ukrainian studies are done in the countries of the world, how the academic knowledge is drawn. And we see that Ukraine is seen through the Russian prism. And in many countries, there is still a certain proclivity to interpret Ukraine through the Russian framework. So it is critical set of challenges for us to tell the world about us, to strengthen the expertise and to have a better mutual understanding between Ukraine and other countries. My second point that I wanted to communicate to you is that based on the recommendations of the New Europe Center, I mostly like the need to differentiate the approaches to the countries made at the governmental level with a different focus made on the humanitarian support or financial support or military support with some perhaps anti-NATO sentiment and accounting for some romanticized Russian opinions. We need to differentiate further our approaches to different stratas of population, addressing humanitarian messages to some and cultural messages to others. So have those differentiated messages and build stronger ties across different countries and different levels of society. We also need to understand that for Ukraine as well as for EU, we need to clearly see that we share our challenges. We need to fight for the understanding in the global societies, in the countries of the world that might be more prone to the Russian narrative, the countries of the South. Recently, I read a study that the countries where Russia sells the weapons to, the countries where the Russian provided vaccines during the COVID pandemic, where the Russian propagandist channel are still broadcasting, are still very much affected by the Russian discourse. If the African countries and Latin American countries are still watching Russia today, then the question for them who's right and who's wrong in the conflict, then we need to see it as a challenge for Ukraine and for the EU as Russia poses a threat to both of us alike. And when we talk about the war to the European societies, we also need to see that there is also a trend to say that Russia isn't a theoretical threat, but a very tangible threat, that it is beneficial to fight Russia, that defending Ukraine from Russia is defending the EU. And even it might come at some cost now, it will bring energy independence down the road. And also we need to say that helping Ukraine counter Russia isn't only beneficial, but it is morally right because people like to support the winners, but also those who do the right thing. So we really need to keep emphasizing it and maintaining this message in the dialogue for us to see that we are fighting for freedom, we are fighting for what is right, and our victory will bring the benefits and the moral advantages to our society and for the Europeans. Thank you.
Дуже дякую, Надія. Дуже дякую. І
Thank you very much, Nadia. And now let's proceed with the comments and observations from our distinguished representatives from the European countries. And the first speaker will be Mr. Roland Frodenstein. Let me quote Roland in the first place, namely his comment given within the topic Europe is interested. We have to mention existential interest of the EU countries in Ukrainian victory and Russia's defeat. It is important to decisively explain the harm caused by Russia and further predictable aggression. You have mentioned, you have outlined very clearly the need for awareness raising, because this is a contribution to solidarity and a unification between the USA and Europe, because they are fighting for the common cause, defeating Russia. In early September, as you wrote, many things have changed in Ukrainian war dynamic. Ukraine has liberated Kharkiv region and Kherson, so it was a very successful counteroffensive. And what is the actual attitude of the Europeans? Are these victories the new inspiration for the Europeans? Can you comment or modify your previous comment somehow today?
Yes, well, thank you for having me. Good morning. Slava Ukraine. I would start by saying that I don't see any danger of attention for the war weakening decisively. And that's independent of how the war is going. I think it's quite remarkable how in the media, in public debates, and on social media, the attention for the war is very, very high, both in the eastern flank countries of the European Union and NATO, but also in the Western member states. So that's one thing. The attention is remaining high. Now, as to the changes since early September, I think, of course, there has been a remarkable string of military successes for Ukraine. This has made a deep impression upon the European societies. I think it's largely, it has had a largely positive effect in the sense that assistance to Ukraine, military assistance, financial help, also political support in the sense of a perspective of EU membership, it makes sense. This is the central takeaway from that development. So most of the effect is positive. Ukraine's military successes have resulted in more people believing that it makes full sense to support Ukraine. Now, I would introduce a small caveat in this, because those people who were skeptical about, for example, military assistance to Ukraine, for several reasons, fear of escalation, Ukraine being painted as a negative actor by some propagandists and so on. But those people who were skeptical about military assistance for Ukraine use Ukraine's military successes as saying, oh yeah, so you see, they don't need us. So that it becomes, for Ukraine supporters, it becomes extremely important to emphasize how necessary further help is, right? So on the one hand, you say it has made perfect sense to send the support that we have, but we have to reinforce our efforts. And that is a narrative which, and this is my third point now, which became very, very clear in the missile crisis earlier this week, when there were explosions in eastern Poland near the Ukrainian border, And, for a short time, there was almost panic for a couple of hours in social media. It was clearly observable that this would now lead to an escalation, that NATO would get drawn into the war. That was at a point when the standing theory was still that it was Russian missiles that hit eastern Poland. Now, in the meantime, after a couple of hours, you had very authoritative statements from the US president, and the next day also from the Polish president, that these were most likely Ukrainian air defense systems, Ukrainian operated air defense systems, so S-300s. And that in itself was not detrimental to our efforts to increase and to maintain and increase support for Ukraine, because, as for example, NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg immediately said, it's Russia that is to blame. If Ukrainian air defense missiles fall on Polish soil by mistake, this would not have happened if it hadn't been for Russia's attack on Ukraine in general, and in particular, the very intensive air raids and missile attacks on that day of around 100 missiles of different types within a very short amount of time. So Russia is to blame. And this narrative was extremely important. I think it largely worked with these societies, with the recipients in Europe. And now we come to the maybe slightly less fortunate part, which is that the Ukrainian government tried to maintain the narrative that this must have been Russian missiles and cannot have been Ukrainian operated air defense missiles for much too long. That had a slightly negative effect on the debate, because the doubters, the skeptics, immediately came up with this narrative that, you see, Zelensky can't be trusted. If the Polish president and the US president say one thing, they didn't say it with 100% accuracy, but they said it's probable that these were Ukrainian missiles. So if that is happening and the Ukrainian president still denies it, then who can we trust? So with all the fantastic respect I have and admiration for the communication by the Ukrainian government up to now, I think this has been a weak moment, because Ukraine doesn't need to deny that this may have been an S-300 missile. It's absolutely unnecessary, as long as the concluding narrative is Russia is to blame, which is the truth, right? So, I hope you don't take it badly that I'm pointing this out, but this is really important for the effort that we jointly want to make here to send the right messages to European societies. But all in all, I think things are going extremely well communication-wise. As I said, the attention is not decreasing, the support is not decreasing. European societies have kept their sympathy and support for Ukraine beyond all expectations, all initial expectations. So I would say that overall it's a totally positive picture. But there are points where we need to improve our efforts, when we need to fine-tune our communication. And I think this week we've seen an example. Thanks.
Дякую, Роланде, дякую за загалом.
Thank you, Roland. Thank you.
Загалом, вибачте.
I'm sorry.
Дякую за спостереження, особливо.
So thank you for these remarks, especially for the first part, when you mentioned that the level of support is still high and the focus of attention has not shifted. As regards this week's events, the comments might be of a different nature, and Generally, we see that this situation has provoked unwelcome comments in the public space from the global media that communicate the idea of confrontation, contradiction between the Ukrainian government and the Western partners. It is clear that a more balanced approach is required under such circumstances. However, while being under such pressure, emotional pressure, missile pressure, it is not always possible to stay sober, to stay balanced. And of course, we Ukrainians count on understanding from our friends and partners abroad. And now I would like to pass the floor to our colleague from Milano, Italy, who represent one of the leading global analytical centers. This is one of the oldest analytical center that deals with the global relations in Italy. We've been partners for a long time, and in 2019 we held a joint event. It was attended by so many participants, and we know that the Italy poses demonstrates interest in the Ukrainian topic. So, Eleonora, what are your observations? What is the attitude inside the Italian society now? Because we got various messages. On the one hand, we know that Italy has provided a huge support. There are over 170,000 Ukrainian refugees in Italy. So Italy ranks second in hosting Ukrainian refugees. However, there were some fears that with the change in Italian government, the level of support for Ukraine will reduce somehow. And still, we see pro-Ukrainian declarations. They might be even stronger than before. So what can we expect in future? We've seen also meetings and protest actions and calls upon peace. So what can be expected from Italy?
Thank you so much, Sergio, for the invitation, and thank you for also reminding me of that great event that we co-organized in Milan. First, I would like to respond to a couple of things that were raised by Roland and Marianna. First, Roland, I completely agree with your assessment of the Poland missile crisis, let's call it this way. And I see sound support for Ukraine not diminishing, because the ultimate responsible is Russia. That message came across. It's well received by the population, but at the same time, it's true that people that are already critical of Ukraine and its President Zelensky took the chance to further criticize the Ukrainian leader and to say, look, we can't really trust someone who basically lies about such an important thing. But I also agree with Sergey that, the way that leadership is exercised at this moment is really remarkable, because it's under very stressful conditions. And then I wanted to respond to something said by Nadia about the lack of Ukrainian expertise. I agree to a certain extent, because in Italy, well, this is my Italian perspective. In Italy, we wouldn't really invest much in the study of the Ukrainian language and culture. It would all be about Russian culture. At the same time, we have a good number of Ukrainian experts that speak Italian and participate in the Italian media debate. First of all, Katia Zarembo from the New Europe Center, but also other journalists and academics. Two of them are based in Italy, and they collaborate with ISFI to the extent that we decided to make them associate researchers to our center, because we felt we really needed to have some Ukrainian expertise, because even if you deal with the region, you still need some specific expertise, and if it's local, it's better. So in my case, I can say, like, the fact that we had so many excellent Ukrainian experts speaking Italian really helped to at least contribute to shaping the public and media debate, especially. That said, back to Sergi's questions. As you know, Italy changed its government in September, and the big fear coming with the victory of the right-wing coalition is that the support for Ukraine would diminish. This has not happened yet. I have to say there are a couple of reasons for concern. First, the price of utilities, as you know, and inflation, as also Marianna was mentioning in her presentation, are a big concern, and the main political mantra of the government is that they want to defend the Italian interests, the interests of the voters. So if the frustration of the voters increases, then it's possible that we can see some variation in the support for Ukraine. And second, it's not really about Meloni per se, but Meloni's partners have a very let's say, embarrassing history of being close to Vladimir Putin. I'm talking about Silvio Berlusconi and Matteo Salvini. So even if they cannot right now openly support Putin, because of course the public condemnation would be too high, they can still let's say spoil the process by, for instance, criticizing sanctions. Matteo Salvini has let's say he kept criticizing sanctions, and even at the highest level has tried to put their effectiveness into question. So of course, this in a context of an economic crisis, these are words that are very heavy. So I would follow this relationship and how it evolves in the coalition, the right-wing coalition, whether these two partners can gain more importance very closely. But also I would like to stress one peculiarity of the Italian public opinion, and that is the pacifist movement that Sergi was mentioning before. We did have a big demonstration for peace, and that of course was criticized by many as being naive or even pro-Putin. The problem, and I discussed it with my Ukrainian friends as well, is that there seems to be a lack of relationship and understanding between the pacifist movement in Italy and the Ukrainian expertise. So one big advice for me would be to build a relationship with the most relevant people in that movement, and also to have an understanding attitude, because it's true that they lack basic knowledge about the conflict, and often their position is politically driven. So they may be very left-wing, very anti-NATO, but that doesn't make them pro-Russia automatically. So we have to find a common language to communicate without being judgmental. And I know sometimes it's difficult because, you know, you keep repeating the same things over and over again, but you have to target your communication. And as Nadia was saying, sometimes you have to adjust to an audience that doesn't have basic knowledge about the situation. So you need to connect in a non-judgmental way. Also, the problem, I think, is that many of the people who criticize this pacifist movement come from a different political camp. So the dialectic now is based on Italian politics. It's no longer about Ukraine so much. This criticism is about political dynamics that are really they're really like right and left wing sort of debate, but it's about the Italian politics. It's not about Ukraine anymore. So another recommendation is to establish this sort of relationship even with the pacifist movement that can have a different understanding of the war, and to gradually shape as well their position. And I think this can be achieved because people can change their mind if they're presented with facts and if they're talked to in a non-judgmental way. And my last advice would be to capitalize on the trial that condemned the responsibles for the MH17 flight, because this is a dramatic incident that probably should have provoked a much tougher response from the West. It didn't. I agree that it didn't, but now we have the culprits, we have names, and so probably we need to invest in more awareness raising about this incident to make people more aware about the dynamics beyond this terrible attack, and how this links Russia to the conflict in Ukraine from its very beginning, not from February 2022. And I think that's it. I look forward to the comments and questions.
Дякую дуже, Леоноро. Хотів би зараз запросити для...
Eleonora, thank you very much. I'd like to give the floor to Katarina Volchuk from the UK. She'll be representing the Chatham House, but she also teaches at the Birmingham University.
Great.
I'm interested in hearing your take on the dynamics of support from the European societies and government to Ukraine, but also as you are following the discourse, you are following the UK policy. We'd be very interested in hearing from you the way the key international actors, the UK, the EU, and the US managed to coordinate their support, maintaining their cohesion and unity, which is one of the driving factors for the support of Ukraine. So, Katarina, over to you.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm happy to present the UK view with some comparative points across Europe. And the UK is a relatively easy target for a variety of reasons. Nevertheless, there are some nuances, and I'll perhaps mention them. What is interesting that the political class is largely on the Ukrainian side. I mean, it's firmly on the Ukrainian side. And whatever critique we have of Boris Johnson, his modeling on Churchill has really been basically like a template for all the sort of prime ministers we've had. The three prime ministers, they stay firmly. This is because what is so important for every country in Europe, Ukraine feeds and sort of fuels the pre-existing sort of narratives and also sort of historical memories. And in the UK, it is the Second World War and being on the right side of history, doing what was right, however difficult it was, and standing up to evil. And that's, from that point of view, the template is really receptive for Ukraine. And what is interesting, the Labour Party, the moderate wing of the Labour Party, is also, because of historical memories, on the same page. Who is not on the same page is the far left, people around Corbyn, Jeremy Corbyn, who was involved in this No to War coalition, which is not only about, like in Italy, about pacifist movement, it's also inadvertently against NATO, against the West and aggression. So it's an example of what I call this autoimmune disease in the West. When it comes to when you don't know or you are not certain, just criticize yourself. And it matters because sort of the far left wing is actually part of that anti-NATO movement. And it's much more important than Ukraine itself, because it's the identity of that wing of the Labour Party. So this is something which basically needs to be targeted very specifically. Another part of the spectrum, so typical of any European country, is the far right. And what is interesting, to what extent Nigel Farage, who was basically one of the supporters of Brexit, has re-emerged now in the media and actually parroting Putin's speaking points. So it's interesting, but it's almost so blatant that one could call him basically a Russian asset. So from that point of view, the far left and far right parties are really trying to distance themselves from mainstream political positions and actually score points by adopting, let's call it sort of the less Ukraine friendly position. So that's about the political class. But what is important historically, that there is a lot of discussion about the UK being on the right side of history, doing the right thing, and also comparing and contrasting with France's and Germany's relative sort of lower level of support. And this actually plays into the Ukrainian position in terms of actually the UK doing the right things, where other countries perhaps dragging their feet a bit more. But from a historical point of view, that really helps. The media has moved a great deal. I would say we've seen a bit of sort of growing sort of immunity to suffering. And the number of casualties has to grow in order to basically to be reported. But nevertheless, the BBC has been doing, and other newspapers, they've been doing stellar job in terms of actually covering Ukraine. And what they do, which works really well, linking it to people on the ground. For example, there was a report about Ukrainian medics on the front line, and that was very effective actually in terms of showing the sort of dedication, commitment, but also suffering on the ground. So the media, the British media, is so important, obviously, because it amplifies, the Guardian and the BBC really amplifies the messages about Ukraine, but we need more and more sort of big events like Kherson, Kharkiv, or actually the bombings, the bombing across Ukraine, to attract more attention. What is worth emphasizing, and I will really echo what's been said already about academia. Amongst the actors, inside the UK, I'm afraid academia is the weak spot, which is rather surprising. Although we have more expertise on Ukraine than in other European countries, interestingly, despite our location, in media there's no doubt that Russian studies are more present, and there is the tendency still it's a much longer process. It takes longer to revise the curricula and to revise the whole approach to looking at Ukraine. It's a slow sort of moving process, but it needs to be basically accelerated. But on the one hand, sort of the prism of Russian studies when it comes to looking at Ukrainian history, for example, and cultural figures, and then we have basically politics and international relations. And those scholars, paradoxically, are less interested in cases like Ukraine. They are much more interested in their own theories and being proven right or with their chosen theories. And the best example comes Mischmeyer, who has actually helped or hasn't helped himself by really giving sort of a quite sort of grotesque interview to the New Yorker and actually undermining and his level of expertise and exposing really what we call cherry picking, just focusing that it's NATO's fault and it's not really Putin, because Putin didn't say he wanted to annex the whole of Ukraine. But academia needs working on, and I'm pleased to say that Ukrainian scholars are present and are very vocal. And it really changes the atmosphere that you cannot talk above our heads about us. So from that point of view, what is in the report, perhaps 2-3 final points, what is in the report is very important in terms of actually basically, let's say, cultural diplomacy. And I would like to emphasize the Banksy's and his basically murals in Ukraine being extremely important. If we could get more artists to Ukraine, and Banksy is an opinion former and he's on the right side. And what is but just little detail, there is this mural with 2 children and there was some kind of anti-tank cross, whatever it's called. And I could see that it was taken away. So that piece of art doesn't look so good as it did before. So a little thing to maximize that, basically maximize that power of that message and attraction that Ukraine has, and perhaps inviting more artists, targeting them to come to Ukraine. The second point is about what's been said already. I think it's very important about, expressing gratitude. It is important, especially in British culture, but also showing the effectiveness, what difference it makes, and that it saves lives. And from that point of view, the campaign to show that anti-defense missiles provided by, let's say, Germany and Norway, they have been very effective in actually saving lives. That's basic gratitude in general, but because it does make a difference. That's very important, especially in the studies in the countries with difficult history like Italy and Germany. And the final point perhaps is about this sort of targeting narratives. As I said, every country is different. And when we look at Greece, the historical arch enemy, it is the Ottoman Empire, not Russia. So how to target Greece? And what are the narrative, the images? And from my point of view, just an idea perhaps, showing the destruction of Orthodox churches and emphasizing that Ukraine is predominantly an Orthodox country and what's happening. So showing sort of this familiarity and showing solidarity basically through the linkages which show the commonality seems to me the best way forward. And perhaps just the final point about cultural diplomacy. I think it would be great, I don't know how it works from a legal or financial point of view, if we could have more Ukrainian film screening. If the embassies could actually do Ukrainian films such as Cyborgs, which is a great look. It looks like a typical war adventure, but it's more like a sort of Shakespearean drama of a group of soldiers. That would be a splendid film to show what happened before the full-scale invasion. And I hope, for example, the Ukrainian Ministry of Culture could basically commission for that film to be screened across the European capitals. And And the fact that from what I remember, it was made by a Crimean Tatar, the director was a Crimean Tatar, again, would be a great sort of display of diversity and unity inside Ukraine. And perhaps the final point, just the very final point about all the things we've been said, Ukraine is great about targeting, campaigns, really innovative, they are great. But they are very often ad hoc and they are not sustained. There are many great videos and products, and they need to be made again and again or showed again and again in different languages. So there's a lot of excellent production, but it can be just sort of shown once or twice and disposed. We need to find a way of actually reproducing it and showing it perhaps in different languages, but making more of it, not just one-off videos, which are excellent, but for example, because they're one-offs, they need to reach a much greater number of people to be effective. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Катерино, дуже дякую за глибокі спостереження. Я заради
Katerina, thank you so much for your very profound insight. I will pose just one question for the speaker for you to be able to respond. Surely, if you have some arguments and comments that you would like to make with each other, please raise your hand and I'll give you the floor. So I have a question to you, Katerina. We had a lot of concerns about the recent change of the Prime Minister in the UK, about Rishi Sunak having not such a strong footing in foreign relations that it might negatively affect the support of London to the Ukraine. This is obviously not the case, but could it happen that Sunak will be more concerned with his domestic agenda rather than the foreign agenda? And these concerns are going to play out. And I have one tiny but a very serious question for Ukraine. Liz Truss within Johnson's government launched an initiative jointly with Poland and Ukraine to organize a triangle for security cooperation. First and foremost, do you see the prospects of this trilateral collaboration under Sunak leadership?
Thank you very much. Yes, the UK is in recession. Obviously, by Ukrainian standards, it's nothing to worry about, what Ukraine is going through economically. But for Britain, it's a big deal. And there is a lot of discussion, and Rishi Sunak is really about economics and domestic affairs. But because of that, he actually he falls into the mold. He follows the pattern. He doesn't challenge, because in order to have a different idea about foreign policy, you need to be concentrated and you want to change things. And he's not a shaker from that point of view. So he's likely to follow. He's likely to follow, especially here, the post-Brexit context helps us a lot. So a cooperation with Canada and the US. And this sort of Euro-Atlantic sort of angle is important. And being on the right side with Canada and the US, it's what the UK is going to follow. So I don't think we have to worry about him changing, but perhaps not paying so much attention. Having said that, the media and society are very clearly, we're talking about a Protestant country where morality, fairness, and basically and honesty is so important. So I just cannot see this changing in the UK, because the understanding, about the stuff evil and suffering is very well formulated here. And the most important thing, we've seen this continuity when it comes to Wallace, the Minister of Defense, and really sort of the boots on the ground and the training of Ukrainian soldiers in Britain has been phenomenally sort of intensive, but also very successful. And this type of cooperation is now well established, and I cannot see this changing. So like sort of my other speakers, I'm fairly optimistic that we won't see any sort of shake-up in Britain in terms of, they may be sort of fewer resources, but in terms of political standing and support, the UK is going to be with Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Katarina. What are the prospects for trilateral cooperation between London, Warsaw, and Kiev? So as far as you see, you're optimistic, yeah?
Yes, I'm slightly about basically trilateral cooperation. I think politically it is important, but in terms of resources, I think it's more now that Poland is going to be the site of this training, basically EU MUM, I think it's called, the training mission. Poland basically is keen on Britain, but I think the EU platform for Poland is most important. So this trilateral cooperation is important, but probably to nag and mobilize other European partners to step into the fray rather than actually deliver, something substantive, because it is really about the US and its support as well.
Дуже дякую. Пані Леоноро, до вас наступне запитання.
The next question for Ms. Eleonora. You are working at the Center studying Russia and Central Asia, so we would like to ask you about the changes in Russia itself. So let's assess the period since the start of the full-scale aggression. How confident is Putin? How realistic is his approach towards the negotiations? Actually, is it probable that he will listen to the voice of the Western partners of Ukraine, and whether he will be listening to them to take his troops out of Ukraine? So when can we expect this?
For the question, it's a difficult one, because unfortunately for people working on Russia and studying Russia, it's increasingly difficult to access our sources. First of all, because I haven't traveled to Russia since February, of course, and also because many of the people I used to talk to at MGIMO, at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, I don't have contact with them anymore. Also, mainly because of the invasion, and it's difficult to have first sources to assess what is going on. But my understanding is that the decision to invade Ukraine basically exacerbated three trends in Russia. First, of course, it's internal authoritarianism. And the consequence of this is pretty clear. We saw the changes in the criminal code. We see so many people fleeing from Russia even before the partial mobilization. Most of my Russian journalists and academic friends are now in Georgia, in Berlin, in Yerevan. So this trend, unfortunately, is going to get worse and worse. The second trend is economic, and the Russian economy was already in a stagnation period, and this is going to get worse. Even though for now the Russian economy didn't collapse as a result of sanctions, but we see like in the medium and long term, probably a degradation of the economic the economy of Russia in many respects. First of all, because they cannot find an alternative source for technology, and as you know, the West, the European Union stopped most of the technological cooperation with Russia. And the third trend is the anti-Western sort of narrative, which became even more vocal. And this is the reason why I am not optimistic about Vladimir Putin listening to the West, because he's building his regime's a resilience and strength mostly on anti-Western narratives. So I don't think he can voluntarily listen to what I don't know, the German government or the French president will say. It has to be forced by conditions, by economic conditions, for instance, or forced by military defeat. And these, of course, are not mutually exclusive. They work together, sanctions, of course, and military support for Ukraine. So unless these conditions get really bad for Putin, he won't listen. This is my assessment. If I may, I wanted to comment on what Katarina was suggesting about film screenings, because this is something I have discussed very recently with Katarina Zarembo, and I was suggesting her to try and establish some sort of cooperation with cultural institutes in Italy that could help organize a Ukrainian film festival, because so far we don't have, as far as I know, a Ukrainian film festival, like a festival that can be organized every year. But we do have a lot of interest, I would say, in Ukrainian film and art industry, which are very thriving. I think it has Ukraine has a lot to show and to share with other European countries in terms of creativity. And for instance, Ukrainian film directors were hosted by the film festival in Lecce, which is my hometown, and I was able to see a couple of films that don't have necessarily to do with the war, but they can just show a positive image of Ukraine, a country that can actually and is actually thriving if, of course, there are the conditions for its artists and directors to do their job. Thank you.
Дуже дякую, Леоноро. Пані Леонора
Thank you very much, Eleonora. Ms. Eleonora has mentioned Ms. Zaremba, who is associate analyst of our center, and she has a good comment of Italian. She used to speak at the joint event in 2019. So many thanks, Eleonora, for raising the topic of Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian movie to raise awareness of Ukraine in the European societies. And at today's event, we've got Nadia Koval. This is the right person to share on the plans of the Ukrainian Institute, which is in charge of cultural international image of Ukraine. Hopefully, Nadia will share the plans of Ukrainian Institute, the plans to disseminate Ukrainian films in Europe. And with that, I would like to hand it over to Mr. Roland. I have a question about the European support on the one hand, and on the other hand, what are the questions from Washington regarding this support? Ukraine has been watching very closely the elections, Congress elections in the US. We've been facing the arguments of those who called upon reducing or auditing at least the support for Ukraine. And one of their narratives is that the Ukrainian war takes place on the European continent, thus the Europeans should invest more in the Ukrainian war than the US. One of the arguments is that the Europeans provide significant support, both military and financial. However, this support is not comparable to the US support. Nonetheless, the European countries host Ukrainian refugees instead. Maybe you've got more arguments to defeat such critical politicians of the US who raise questions about the level of the European support, or maybe you may know how to increase the support from Europe to avoid further questions from Washington.
Yeah, excellent question, Siddhi. It's not easy. First of all, the midterms have weakened the Trumpist faction within the Republican Party. That's a good thing. But you know, the frustration about a European effort, which is still seen as lacking, goes far beyond the Trumpist wing of the Republican Party. So this comprises basically all moderate Republicans and even a good share of the Democratic Party in Washington. So while US society, public opinion remains firmly in support of Ukraine, you know, I mean, this is to an extent that we have not seen in decades, that the US population was so emotionally engaged with another country. But having said that, I think that, you know, the US support for Ukraine will remain even more bipartisan if and when the European support increases, right? It sounds paradoxical maybe to some, but the thing is that if more Americans and more mainstream centrist Americans, decision makers in Washington, get the impression that the Europeans are not pulling their weight, then they will likely lose out to those Americans who have been opposing US support for Ukraine from the beginning. You know, and that's both the leftist, the radical left of the Democratic Party, but most of all, of course, the far right in US politics. You know, the people who say not one more cent for Ukraine, we need all the money to go to building the southern wall against illegal migration and so on. So you know, both the US support and European support have to be seen as one thing, and each side of this support will reinforce the other one. And that's a very important point to make in the European debate, where you do have, of course, still people who say that because America is turning away from Europe anyway, in every respect, you know, not just concerning Russia and Ukraine, but the US are pivoting to East Asia, to China. So Europe has to take care of its own security. And sometimes the people who are saying this would argue for more support for Ukraine, but some of those people are exactly the same usual suspects who have always argued that we need to arrange ourselves with Russia somehow, you know. And you know, yeah, there's a strange new type of pundit, of academic political expert emerging here. What I call the liberal realists. You know, these are people who come from the left. I mean, not the radical left at all, moderate left, but who suddenly sound like John Mearsheimer when they talk about, you know, boys will be boys, superpowers will always be superpowers, they will always want their spheres of influence. You know, this talk about NATO Eastern enlargement or actual NATO Eastern enlargement has poked the bear in the eye. I mean, sometimes you have the same speech memes used by these people that you otherwise hear from John Mearsheimer, Niall Ferguson, and Jordan Peterson, right? It's absolutely amazing. So, you know, to map out this landscape of debate, is, I think, a very important step towards fighting and confronting the people who still talk about peace negotiations now, and who would completely condemn Ukrainian alleged refusals to negotiate, and you know, while they don't mention the conditions under which negotiations would start, you know, which are of course very, very different from the Russian and the Ukrainian side. So, you know, to confront this side of the debate, I think is very important. And I'm not saying that we should try to convince the other side of this argument. We need to win the hearts and minds of the bystanders, so to speak, you know, of the people who are not completely on one side. And that is, for that, it is, of course, important to keep on confronting the appeasers and the people who claim that it's not in the interest of either the United States or Europe, European countries, to help Ukraine to this extent. I think if we are consistent and we consider this, we define this as a political challenge, I think we're already a long way to success here. So to sum it up, I don't think the midterms have changed anything strategic about US support for Ukraine, but I think the good people in Europe need to re-emphasize their point that US support will only remain so high if European support increases, right? And American centrists and moderate conservatives and moderate liberals do not have the impression that the US is going far beyond its due share in supporting Ukraine. That's what I would say.
Дуже дякую, Роланде. Пані Надія, ну, власне, були б дуже вдячні.
Thank you very much, Roland. And now over to Nadia. Please share the plans of the Ukrainian Institute. What are the intentions regarding spreading Ukrainian films, Ukrainian movies, and what is being done at the moment? Maybe our debate will give an impetus to the Ukrainian Institute to be more active in this stream. And what are the future prospects? Quite frequently, I have to answer the questions about next year's key challenges, next year's prospects, and what else the US and the European allies should take into consideration. So maybe you could outline the main key challenges for the next year. Thank you for this question. In fact, this year has been quite special, quite unique for the Ukrainian Institute. On the one hand, this terrible war provoked an outburst of interest to our activity and to Ukrainian culture in general. So this interest toward Ukrainian culture has made a dramatic surge. And this year in Great Britain, for instance, the month of Ukrainian movies is ongoing. Various Ukrainian movies and documentaries are being demonstrated. And quite recently, the Festival of Ukrainian Films in Poland took place. Of course, we're not going to stay idle. We have new plans. In Italy this year, we were quite active during the Florence Biennale, and we have been raising the topic of Ukrainian culture and its peculiarities. However, there is a challenge, of course. The country is amidst a war, and the public budget is unable to allocate great funds to finance the foreign of the international events, and we survived due to partners, due to the support of those who co-finance our events and demonstrate their sympathy in other ways, helping us to arrange events. I believe that we will continue such an activity. Of course, more than the half of Ukrainian budget is now allocated to the military operations. However, it is important to keep this support in the long-term prospect. But for our partners who will experience great difficulties, however, we'll be doing our best. And in this context, let me also give a
Коли ми зараз
comment on the
говоримо
previous discussion.
політичні рішення, які приймаються прямо зараз, то видно оцю, знаєте, інерцію, яку
As we
вони
talk about the political decisions made now, they are often carried over by the previous knowledge of Ukraine. I will mention one survey. We made a long-term survey from 2014 to 2018
приймають
about the perception of the Ukrainian-Russian conflict in the countries of the West. And then it was apparent that there was just one country, Poland, where they perceived as a Russian aggression, as a military conflict that had to be rebutted. So this is the only country, Poland, where this opinion prevailed. In all the other countries, there was some range of opinions about the culpability of Russia, and maybe dialogue could still be possible. Some historic arguments of Russia may stand as people had very little knowledge of the Ukrainian history, and some exceptions to the international law could stand. And now we look at these countries and we see the analytical discussion amongst the intellectual developing about the war, about the decisions made. If this understanding was there earlier about the Russian-Ukrainian conflict and the evolution of relations between the countries was better known, then perhaps the support would be much stronger and would gain greater momentum. This knowledge of the country is instrumental in shaping the political decisions. So we need to shape the cultural knowledge about Ukraine, the political knowledge about Ukraine. And if we take the theories of conflict, who don't really follow the developments on the ground. So here I'm with Eleonora, who is saying that there are some researchers in some countries, including Italy and the Ukrainians, like the researchers and academics Katerina mentioned, who can narrate the key messages. That is absolutely true, but still, these researchers are few and far between. Some researchers gained an interest in Ukraine and they have become a center point. And we would like that knowledge to become institutionalized. We want Ukrainian studies or knowledge of Ukraine or some regional studies of Eastern Europe become institutional and develop and gain momentum and be a realistic reflection. Katerina mentioned Greece, and this is my favorite country for research. I've been researching it for a score of years, and we can see a shift of opinion there. When we studied the Greek policy in 2015, it was striking to see that the shared Orthodox heritage that Katerina referred to, or the large Greek diaspora in Ukraine, or any similarity of security challenges from the neighbor, much greater and much more aggressive to you, all that failed earlier. In the perception of the Greek society and Greek expert, it was that Russia is beneficial for their security, so the Russian narrative had a certain sway and were well received in Greece. But that has been upturned now. Now, this is pro-American, pro-Greek. We need to build a dialogue with the Greek society. So this is a good example of the opinions that can change, and we have all the prerequisites for that. Thank you. Thank you, Nadine. Unfortunately, our time is elapsing. We only have 60 minutes left until the end of the event. And I would like to give the floor to Mariana Fakhrudinova, who shared just a fraction of the findings on European support. And there was a very important part that dealt with an analysis of the hybrid warfare of Russia in the European countries. Our analytical team back in 2018 made an analysis of the way Russia meddled in a number of European countries in order to sow discord, in order to lessen the attention to the Russian aggression, to mitigate the sanctions policy. And we had the task of identifying the weaknesses, the pitfalls of the Russian hybrid operations to show the resilience embedded in the European society, the reluctantness to fall for the Russian narrative. And we see that Russia is by far not successful in its propaganda. The sanction policy was there in place and grew stronger. No matter what this hybrid intervention is made by the Russian, today the European societies have opened their eyes. And Russia wanted to sow discord,
небувалої трансатлантичної єдності і небувалої
and
світової
yet we are seeing incredible cohesion and attention to Ukraine.
поза тим, Маріанно, які у нас були, ми вирішили порівняти, що було в 18-му році і що змінилося зараз в 22-му в плані цих російських гібридних
So we
операцій.
wanted to compare the hybrid operations made in 2018 and now. How they different? What are the key findings?
Оскільки залишається у нас кілька хвилин до кінця заходу, ми
I'll be very brief, as there are only a few minutes remaining. When we study the concerns in the European society,
гібридні інтервенції Кремля, тому що думали, що в принципі вони
we needed to look at the hybrid interventions of Crimea as they could shape and sway public opinion in Europe. So we drew on the methodology of 2018. We looked at the instruments and found that mostly following the full-scale invasion,
ефективними. Зокрема, ми брали такі
they have
інструменти.
proven to be ineffective. We have looked at high-level contacts. We looked at political and economic ties between the EU and Russia. And if before the full-scale invasion, it did work, at least partially, but now we see that European businesses that had to put pressure on their government to lift sanctions or to stay away from the severe sanctions Russia, as Russia had hoped, had in fact withdrawn from the Russian market. Russia hoped to maximize its energy level, the disinformation.
Ефективно спрацьовували в європейських країнах.
And yet those levers have failed in the European countries. So the EU repositories have been filled up to the maximum, and the EU is ready for the upcoming winter. We are seeing limitations on the Russian broadcast and other Russian media outlets being curbed in the West, and even the steps like the deliberate provocation of the migration crisis, which happened quite recently at the Belarus border with Ukraine, with the Ukrainian refugees who, with the beginning of the full-scale invasion, started fleeing to Europe. This migration crisis had also failed because that worked to coalesce the Ukrainian countries in support of the Ukrainian refugees and Ukraine. So we are in final conclusion that the Russian wasn't as effective as it had hoped, despite the fears, despite some reservations. The European societies and governments have shown resilience and stability to the Russian influences. So there's good news there. We should never underestimate the Russian cloud and the Russian influences, but Ukraine has a place to offer its narrative, to coalesce and maintain support for the future, trying to build on the positive developments. Thank you. Over to you, Sergei. Thank you, Mariana. Dear colleagues, I'm ever grateful to you. We have one last minute. Should anyone have something to say in this last minute, I'd like to thank you for being with us. I'd like to thank you for standing with Ukraine by your research. Thank you for your advice and recommendations. Thank you for sharing your insights. Thank you for criticizing the Ukrainian actions. It all is very well received. We are very grateful to you, to our steadfast friends in Europe, in the world, standing with Ukraine now until we win together. Thank you. Glory to Ukraine. Until we meet again.